morning and welcome to the second lecture in our 2021 series. I am Roland Kuschel. Anne Hargraves and I are co-chairs of the summer lecture series. We owe thanks to the Osher volunteers and staff who have been working for months to make this series possible, and to Dartmouth's conference and events team who have guided us through the technology. We owe thanks also to our underwriters, Caldwell Law, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Kendall at Hanover, The Village, Wells Fargo Advisors, and to the sponsors of this session, Dartmouth Hitchcock Health and Muskoma Bank. Let's give them all a round of applause. Be sure to thank them if you run into them around town. And now some housekeeping details. We ask that you direct your questions to us through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will accept questions during the speaker's presentation and during the break. Closed captioning is available. If you would like to turn it on, just click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you encounter technical difficulties, please email osher.dartmouth.edu or call 603-646-0154. Again, those contacts are osher.dartmouth.edu and 603-646-0154. Our speaker this morning is David Autor, one of the most influential labor economists of his generation. He is the co-director of the IT Task Force on the Work of the Future and the National Bureau of Economic Research's Labor Studies Program. He is the Ford Professor and Associate Head of MIT's Department of Economics. Please welcome David Autor.
Thank you very much, Roland. It's a delight to be here. And I'm going to be speaking about the work of the future and where will it come from. And I look forward to the comments and interaction with my longtime friend and associate, Bruce Sacerdote of Dartmouth, who's a person who has great expertise on this topic and has always excellent and interesting ideas. And I look forward to the discussion with the people who are participating today. So let me share my screen and get started. And I hope to talk for no more than 45 minutes, maybe even less, and then that'll hopefully leave extra time for interaction. So here we go. I'm going to start this screen sharing. Great. Okay, so with luck, you can all see that. And so as said, the title of my talk is The Work of the Future, Where Will It Come From? And this reflects a work that I have done independently, work by many scholars in economics and elsewhere, and also a lot of the work of the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future, which I co-led over the course of 2 years. This was set up by MIT President Raphael Reif to ask the question, how is technology changing? How is technology changing work? What are the opportunities and the challenges that creates? And what are the points of leverage that we can use to make sure that we minimize harms and maximize collective benefits? And so that was the set of questions we were hoping to address. So let me start off with a very natural question to ask, which is why, after a century of astounding innovations, why are there still so many jobs remaining? So more concretely put, over the last 200 years, we have just been remarkably inventive in creating labor-saving innovations. We invented, the internal combustion engine to reduce the backbreaking labor in farms and replace it with, with tractors and other machines. We invented the assembly line to reduce slow, inaccurate artisanal labor and replace it with, highly productive, highly consistent assembly line labor. Or we invented, computers to remove, cumbersome, error-prone human calculation, replace it with digital precision. And these inventions have worked We no longer, dig ditches by hand. We don't pound tools out of wrought iron. We don't do bookkeeping with actual books. And yet the share of the workforce in the US, or share of adults, in the US and most advanced economies that are participating in the paid labor force has risen over the course of a century. A lot of that reflecting the movement of women out of unpaid, highly constrictive domestic labor into the paid labor market, where they have many more opportunities to, pursue interests and use their skills and leadership capabilities. So why hasn't all this automation made our labor redundant and our skills irrelevant? So let me first start by giving you a kind of a four-part answer to that question. So the first part of that answer is what I'm just going to call insatiability. The idea that as we get more affluent, our desires for consumption tend to rise at 1.1, about just as fast, maybe a little bit faster. And so we don't run out of things to want. So here's a famous photograph by Peter Menzel. This is the Caven family of American Canyon, California, and all of their material possessions. This photograph was taken in 1985. And you can see they're a typical middle class family of that time. And you look at the things they possess, from bookshelves full of books to multiple appliances, bicycles, toys, etc. And I'm sure if we were to take this photograph now, 35 years later, we would find many, many more belongings. And you can see that very few of those things that you're looking at would you call necessities, right? They all reflect the product of centuries of productivity growth that have made people so much wealthier that they can fill their houses with all kinds of luxuries. And what does this reflect? They're typical of Americans, or typical of middle-class people throughout the world, in that as incomes and living standards have risen, consumption choices have risen directly alongside of them. So we tend to take our higher incomes as we become wealthier, and we don't use them as much for leisure as you might predict, but instead for additional consumption. And that, of course, creates work, right? We create work for one another by continually raising our desires as our material means increase. That's one component of the answer. The second is, when we think about automation, it's very natural to think about how machines replace us, how they do the work that we used to do, and therefore we don't have to do it anymore. But that certainly occurs. There's no question that we have automated ourselves out of a lot of work in agriculture, for example, or in manufacturing, or even now in information processing, where a lot of routine clerical tasks are done by machines. But in many ways, machines are not simply replacing us, but also making us more productive, making our own labor more valuable. So, for example, if you are a roofer, having a air-driven pneumatic nail gun allows you to, accomplish much more work in the course of a day. It's not making you redundant; it's just making you more productive. Or if you are a medical professional, having access to hundreds of sophisticated diagnostic tests doesn't make your work less relevant or necessary. It makes it more effective, more valuable, because presumably you're doing more of the right stuff. If you are an architect or a designer, having a CAD tool, a design tool, sure, it saves you time on paper drafting, but it also increases the range of ideas that you can explore, that you can calculate the engineering specifications for, and ultimately the sort of variety and ingenuity of the things that you can create using only your own mind and a set of sophisticated tools. If you are an educator, hopefully our era of digital communications increases your reach, allows you to reach more people, as hopefully we are doing right here, than would ever be physically possible, and at lower cost, meaning more people can benefit from that work. Even if you are a trucker, a long haul trucker, having access to cloud-based routing tools means that you can drive without ever having an empty load, that you always know where the next pickup is, and there's no reason to be hauling around a truck that doesn't have deliverables inside of it. So in all these ways, all these technologies don't simply make our work unnecessary. In many, many cases, they just make our work more effective and ultimately more valuable. So that's a second reason why we have not automated ourselves into irrelevance. A third reason, and I think this is the least talked about, is that when we advance our technology, we don't just do more of the same things with greater efficiency. We do some of that. We also create new forms of services, of goods, of experiences that create new demands for human expertise that make us, in some sense, necessary or valuable in a new set of activities. So, for example, this shows you in 1940, the US labor force was approximately 45 to 50 million workers. In 2018, if you were to look at the number of people doing the jobs that existed in 1940, you would say, oh, interesting. The number of workers has risen from 40 million, let's say, to 50 million. That's only a 20% increase. But we know that the size of the labor force has tripled in that time. So what's everybody else doing? Well, it turns out that about 2/3 of all the work at present is in new job titles, new narrow tasks, or new specialized tasks that didn't exist 80 years ago. Most of what we do today is new relative to what was being done in 1940. Now, of course, you're saying, what do you mean by that? So let me give you some concrete examples. The US Census Bureau actually, not by intention, keeps a catalog of all the new things people do. The reason this is the case is that this should not say 1920, it should say 1940. When you fill out your census form, they ask you what is your industry and what is your occupation. If you recall, there's no checkbox there where you check off an industry or occupation. You just write down, you describe what you do. You could say, I'm an automatic welding machine operator. So the Census Bureau has to code those responses and classify them to a consistent set of occupations. And so they kind of have a catalog of things that people write in, and then they match those things to the categories that they're familiar with. And as people write in new things that they haven't seen before, they check with their supervisor, they say, is this new? What is this? And then they add this to the catalog. And so by comparing these successive catalogs across decades, you can actually see what's being added over time. So for example, in 1940, enough people said that they were, or in the 1940 census, enough people said that they were automatic welding machine operators. They hadn't seen that before in 1930, that this got added to the catalog. Or in 1950, airplane designers. Or in 1980, controllers of remotely piloted vehicles. In 2000, artificial intelligence specialists, which actually seems like they were they were right on time with that one. Or in 2018, pediatric vascular surgeons. So looking at this list, you might think, oh, I see. So all this new work has to do with people who, invent new technology, use new technology, install and integrate new technology, service new technology, sell new technology. And that's part of it. But on the other side of this list are examples that are actually would be just as prevalent in these data. And these are new services that were effectively occupations involve new services. So acrobatic dancers, pageant directors, hypnotherapists, amusement park workers, sommeliers, drama therapists. These were all things that people started writing in various decades that the Census Bureau hadn't seen enough of before to create its own separate category. And many of these things you can see really don't have an obvious technological component. They reflect changes in tastes, changes in demographics that create new demands for services for children, for people who are older, or just new luxuries. But all of them, the reason they're new work is they require some specialization, some form of expertise that wasn't previously available. So for example, if you look at the number of medical titles over time, right, it's proliferated from the dozens to the hundreds. And that's not because what medical doctors are doing is getting narrower and narrower, and so they just get more specialized. It's also the depth of expertise is growing. And so it's not possible for one person to be at the frontier of all these activities. They have to specialize. So as we create these new types of work, we create new demands for human creativity, for human ingenuity, and for human specialization. And eventually many of these things themselves become automated or go out of fashion. But when they are new, they require the kind of adaptability, flexibility, dexterity, on the spot problem solving that people are extremely good at supplying. Okay, so just to kind of give you a little, make this a little more concrete, this just shows you the distribution of employment in 1940 across 12 exhaustive, mutually exclusive categories, ranked from roughly lowest paying to highest paying. So you can see, for example, that in 1940, the two biggest categories of employment were farming and mining one, and production work on the other. And then in the green bars, I show you employment in 2018 in those same categories in bodies, number of people. And you can see that these two, farming and mining and production, actually contracted in absolute terms. There are fewer people working in agriculture, fewer people working in production work in 2018 than there were in 1940, even though the labor force is 3 times as large. So where did everybody go? Well, many of them are now in professional and managerial jobs and clerical and administrative jobs and in personal services. And most of the work that they're doing is work that had not been invented, that didn't have one of those corresponding titles 80 years ago. So you can see that a lot of the growth of the work we do today reflects things that in some sense were not present 80 years ago. Okay, so that kind of, I hope, gives you a sense of why we have not run out of work so far. Why we have not automated ourselves into irrelevance. So if you accept that premise that, okay, the problem doesn't appear to be that we're running out of work, that's not the issue that we're facing, will the work of the future take care of itself? Does that mean, hey, I can stop, if I was ever worried about this problem, Autor has just told me I don't need to worry about it anymore. Thanks very much. Go and have a cup of coffee. Have a nice weekend. So no, that's not what I'm attempting to imply. There are challenges, but they don't primarily have to do with the quantity of jobs. So this figure shows you, as a well-known figure, of the trajectory of productivity and compensation, I'll define terms in a second, over the last roughly 70 years, from 1948, the end of the Second World War, a few years after the end of the Second World War, to 2018. So let me first draw your eye to this purple series, or magenta if you like, productivity per hour. This refers to the amount of stuff or output in dollar terms, in real dollar terms, produced by a worker per hour. So roughly, productivity has increased by 250% in these 70 years. And a lot of that growth has happened in approximately the last 40, not all of it, less than, but a substantial amount of it. So we've gotten a lot wealthier in the last 40 years. So anyone who tells you that things have not improved at all in the last 40 years, on average, that's not at all true. Many, many things have changed many things that we've gotten much more effective. Now you can look at average compensation. This is how much workers are paid, the average worker is paid. And you can see from kind of 1948 to 1978, these two things, productivity and average compensation, move in lockstep. And then after that time, they diverge somewhat, meaning that average compensation of workers is growing less rapidly than productivity per hour. What that gap means is that more of the income in the economy is being paid to capital, owners of capital, and less to workers in the form of wages. But now here's the real shocker. If you look at the median compensation, meaning the level that half of people make above and half of people make below. So this is not taking an average of anything. We just rank people by their earnings and we say, this is the person at the 50th percentile. 50% of people earn more than this person, 50% earn less. You can see that median compensation has increased almost not at all since 1980. So we've had lots of growth in productivity, and that has raised the average, but it hasn't benefited the typical worker nearly as much. And you say, well, how is that possible? How can the average be rising so much and the median's barely moving? Well, the answer is inequality, right? The distribution of incomes has become so skewed that the average is rising because people above the median are making so much more, but the median isn't changing because all that that rising productivity is accruing to people to people above the typical individual, right? So most of the money is trickling up, so to speak. Now you can look at this figure and you can say, oh, this is crazy. It can't be the case that the median hasn't risen. It must have grown a lot. You're just understating the real levels. And there's some value to that argument, right? It's really hard to know for sure compare the quality of living or the standard of living or income over time because things are so incommensurate, right? We have better technologies right now, but look, we have more crowded streets. We have better healthcare, but education is so much more expensive. So how do you sort of make those things commensurate? And it's true. So we could be wrong about this median compensation. However, if we were wrong about median compensation, we would be about equally wrong about productivity per hour. So if this should be higher, this should be higher too. And so the gap between those two is very likely to be accurate, to be meaningful of a rising gap between the effectively the average and the median, or between productivity and the median, even if the levels of those should both be higher in some terms. So it's important to offer that caveat and the defense against that caveat. So to continue, so why did this happen? Why was it the case? Actually, go back a slide. Why was it the case that in the first 3 post-war decades, roughly, kind of all these things rose together, and over the last 4 decades, even as productivity has grown, not as rapidly, but has grown, we've seen such a different set of outcomes for the typical worker? Well, I think there's 3 parts to this answer. So the first one has to do with sorry, I apologize. I did not say that. Let me just say, why did things work so well in the first 3 decades? So I would say, so between 1948, if we think of this as a tale of 2 eras, right? This first era from 1948 to 78, and the next one in the subsequent 40 years, what went right in the first 3 that didn't go right in the next 3? So the first force was rapid productivity growth. So as you saw in the post-war era, there was just a remarkable flood of innovations and spread of prosperity. And so that helped a lot. That created a tailwind that tended to raise incomes. However, that's not enough. In fact, we've had relatively rapid productivity growth by historical standards, even over the last 4 decades. The second thing is the type of work that was being created. We had growing employment in middle skill, non-college jobs, office work, production work, managerial work. Much of this work took people who didn't have extremely high levels of education, just moderate, reasonable, good levels of education, and made them highly productive. Production work is a great example. People, the factory system or mass production is just an incredible invention for taking people without high levels of formal training and high levels of formal education, allowing them to do highly, highly productive work using, kind of carefully trained repetitive activities. And so production work was sort of an engine for creating relatively well-paid middle-class jobs. The third thing that we had, and it's easy to overlook the importance of this, is we had strong egalitarian institutions. We had effective labor unions, meaningful minimum wage laws that really did push up the bottom. We had an expansion of civil rights in voting, in the workplace and elsewhere, and growing job standards, safety standards, and social safety net, all of which supported this process of rising productivity, growing relatively good jobs, and then a set of institutions around the edges that affected the distribution, that tried to ensure that no one who was working did too badly, that the forces of equality were advancing, although very far behind where they could be. And in some sense, also came at a cost, in that there was a very high rate of taxation on very high earners, and there was a fair amount of post-market redistribution. And that gave rise to an incredibly even rate of growth of household incomes across the distribution. So this shows you the growth rate of household incomes in 5 quintiles of distribution, from the lowest to the highest, plus the top 5%, just splitting them out. And you can see these are all growing really rapidly. Now, let me make it clear, a 2.5% growth rate of the highest fifth is much more money than a 3% growth rate of the lowest fifth. It's not to say that everyone was getting equally wealthy, but in proportional terms, these things were not pulling apart, right? So if you're making $1 million, 3.5% is $35,000, and if you're making $1,000, 3.5% is $35, right? So there's a big difference, but still these growth rates were fairly comparable, and that meaning the distribution was not pulling apart in proportional terms. So what happened in the next 4 decades? Well, I would say there were 3 countervailing forces at play. One was decelerating productivity growth. It was still rapid by historical standards, but it was not torrid at the rate of the post-war World War II decades, which were highly anomalous. And that decelerating productivity growth made it harder to support institutions that were egalitarian. People, when prosperity is not rising as fast, people don't feel as generous. The second is we faced real technological headwinds. We saw a hollowing out of many of these middle-skilled non-college jobs, shrinking production in office and administrative jobs, growing employment in high education, high pay, professional, technical, and managerial jobs. That's good, but those jobs are only accessible to people with higher levels of formal education. And then growing employment in low education, low pay personal services. And so I'll talk about where that comes from. A lot of it is technological. Some of it also has to do with globalization. But the net effect is, as I'll show you briefly in a moment, the kind of distribution of the type of jobs available polarized. And then finally, we saw the weakening of labor market institutions, the rapid contraction of private sector labor unions, not in the public, the erosion to near irrelevance of the federal US minimum wage, the near stasis of civil rights legislation after 1964, and also a complete plateauing of job standards and the social safety net. It's not that all these things reverted or receded, some of them did, but even those that, but even in the best case, most of those merely went into stasis. They stopped advancing. If you compare the growth of household incomes in these two periods, right, you can see that they're qualitatively different, and the growth of household incomes was highly skewed in the second period. Just extremely upward sloping and steeply upward sloping, and among the bottom, essentially 3/5 of US households, income growth was 1/10 to 1/3 what it was in the preceding decades. Let me be clear, you might say, well, if you just add up these bars, there's not so much height to go around. But of course, if you're making this bar really high, you have to take a lot away from all the other bars because so much more money is involved. So if there's an additional exercise I should do to make that point more visually clear. So, and what are some manifestations of this fact? Well, one is if you look at the real incomes of workers by education level, these are incomes indexed to 1963. So at 1963, effectively is 100%, and then you can look at growth rates from that growth relative to that in that time. So between 1963 and roughly 2017, the real weekly earnings of people with a graduate degree rose by 90%. The real earnings of those with a college degree rose by about 45%. The real earnings of those with who are high school dropouts, high school grads, or some college rose very little. And if you compare them to 1980, they actually fell in real terms. So there was a substantial drop in earnings of men without high levels of formal education. And most of the earnings gains eventually went to people with post-college educations. If you look at that figure for women, you see something similar. It's more encouraging in that everybody seems to do better in net. But of course, this fanning out of our earnings by education means that the vast majority of income gains went to the subset of people without high levels of formal education. You might say, well, what fraction is that people? Well, are those people at present, about 35% of US workers have a 4-year college degree. And then among those who have a 4-year college degree, about 1/3 have a graduate degree, right? So we're talking about 15% of the workforce that are in these green categories. Alongside of that and related to this is the change in the structure of work. So I previously lined up these occupations from lowest paid to highest paid, and so here I'm doing that again. So in the bottom left side of this figure, you have a lot of these in-person personal service occupations, food service, cleaning, protective service, entertainment and recreation. And laborers. Moving from there, you have a lot of the kind of middle paid jobs, production workers, administrative support and office workers, sometimes sales people. And then in the third section of the graph, you have technical, professional, and managerial workers. And you can see there's this distinct kind of barbell shape to this figure with a lot of poundage on either end of the bar and not so much in the middle. And what is going on there? Well, I think we reasonably well understood that a lot of these middle skill jobs were comprised of of what you might call routine codifiable tasks that required, precision, cognitive, regularity, calculation, repetitive movement. But many of them, because the tasks are formalized and codified, well understood, they could eventually be encoded in software and executed by machines. And that's what we see in a lot of office work, where there's many, many fewer people doing those kind of phone answering, typing, filing, and even hand calculating there used to be. And in production work, where on factory floors, there's much more automation and machine monitoring. If you look in, in auto factories at this point, there are more robots and robot-like machines than there are auto workers. So a lot of that is hollowed out. As that's occurred, more people have moved into the top doing this, kind of high-level analytical and interpersonal work, which is terrific. And those who have not increasingly find themselves doing personal services, and personal services are valuable. I don't mean to demean them, but many of them use generic skill sets that do not require high levels of formal education, that people who are of sound mind and body are able to accomplish, because they have the flexibility, they have the dexterity, they have the spoken skills and language skills to do that work. And because the supply of people who can do that work is abundant, because the skills aren't specialized, it's hard for those jobs to have high wages. It's hard to create enough competition in the labor market for employers to be willing to pay high wages to get people to do that work. The main thing that causes wages to rise in that work is not really scarcity of skills, but scarcity of people. When the labor market is really tight, we see earnings tend to rise in this type of work and not otherwise. Whereas if you have a rise in demand for, let's say medical doctors or lawyers, you can't just get people off the street to do that work. They have to be highly educated and highly trained and specialized. And so when demand rises, their pay tends to rise rather than just the quantity of people doing the work. So what has gone wrong? Why have the last 4 decades looked so different? I think I've hinted at that. Let me just spend a little more time on that. One is, as I said, this shifting, maybe I haven't said this. One is the kind of shifting locus of the type of technology we're producing. So maybe let me, rather than summarize this figure in detail, which is probably too much information, let me just say, we have moved from an era of innovation in making things to innovation in making ideas. Moved into an era where most of the new technologies that are coming online have to do with instruments and information, electronics and computing. And that has had implications for what type of work are increasingly valuable. Because if we're creating new work, a lot of the creation new work is related to where innovation is occurring. And as innovation has moved into these knowledge intensive and increasingly abstract realms of activity, that has placed a premium on people who do abstract skills. And so when in the era from 1930 to 1980, when most of the innovation was occurring in manufacturing, a lot of the work was creating new types of production jobs, new specialized work in factory floors, often not requiring a college degree. As innovation has moved towards these kind of abstract technologies having to do with creating ideas and manipulating information, innovation has moved much more into these professional and technical and managerial categories that deal with those and are complemented by those activities. And you can see this, by the way, I mentioned earlier the importance of the growth of new work. Let me sort of show you how that has changed over time. So this shows you between 1940 and 1980, kind of the stock of existing work and the flow of new work done by non-college workers. And you can see in these 4 decades, both the stock of existing work, the blue line, and the flow of new work are concentrated in clerical administrative support, production, construction, and transportation. So we're on these kind of middle paid jobs. If you roll the clock forward another 4 decades, what you see is the blue lines representing the stock of existing work. It continues to be the case that people without college degrees are disproportionately found in construction, transportation, production, and clerical work. But the flow of new work is not there anymore. The largest single category where new work is emerging is in these low-paid personal services. And in some degree, of course, also in health services, unfortunately, the low-paid part of health services, and in technical, professional, managerial work. So the flow of new work has polarized, just like this barbell I was showing you earlier, especially for non-college workers. If we look for college workers, college educated, you can see in the early part of the 20th century, or the early post-war decades, both the stock of existing work and the flow of new work were concentrated in office work, professional and managerial work. And over the last 4 decades, that's only become even more true. It's become even more concentrated at the high end. In professional and managerial, we see a growth in technicians and noticeably a shrinkage in the emergence of new work in clerical and office work, because so much of that has been automated. So this kind of changing locus of innovation has changed where new work emerges. And I want to say that the changing locus of innovation itself is a choice, is something that we choose where to invest. That doesn't happen on its own. That's not an autonomous process. The second force that has been so consequential is our management or mismanagement of the benefits of globalization. So the kind of iconic case here would be the China trade shock. So when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, we saw a just dramatic increase in the share of all U.S. consumption that was effectively made in China. This is U.S. import penetration from China, this orange line. And in the same period, we saw an extremely rapid decline in manufacturing employment. Manufacturing employment fell by about 25% in the course of 7 years, and then fell by another 11 or 12% during the Great Recession that followed. And this had highly concentrated results across manufacturing intensive communities in the United States. So for example, this shows you that where these impacts would be felt would be, of course, the places that are making the kinds of goods that China became highly productive and highly competitive in. So furniture and fixtures, in textiles, and I guess here are some other, those are not other good examples. Let me stop there. So for example, take the case of Martinsville, Virginia, which was a textile area, right? 45% of adults were working in manufacturing in 1990. By 2016, that was 13%. The fraction of adults who were employed at all fell from roughly 3/4 to roughly half. And payments in government transfers per capita rose by 230%. You could look at the example of West Hickory, which is in Pennsylvania, and that's a big furniture making town, and you see something similar. Now, I want to emphasize China's rise as a incredibly productive, incredibly technologically advanced nation has had huge benefits, not only to China, where it's brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but also it's created prosperity throughout Central and South America. It's created investment in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's an incredibly good thing. It's basically created the world middle class. But it's been a bit traumatic for the United States, and the U.S. did not handle this, did not make the most of this opportunity. It allowed the cost of that adjustment to be heavily borne by a small subset of workers and communities, even though many of us, of course, benefited in terms of lower prices and greater variety of goods available. Okay, so it's not that globalization per se is a bad thing, but I would say it's been badly managed by U.S. policy. The third crucial factor is institutional erosion. And here I think there's both sins of omission and sins of commission. So this shows you the real value of the federal minimum wage in 2019 dollars. And if you look at this figure, it implies, and I think this is reasonable, that the US federal minimum wage is no higher in real terms in 2020 than it was in 1950, even though we know that average output per hour of work has risen by almost 200% in that time period. Right. So that's a remarkable decision, or the remarkable fact that we've just decided to allow the minimum wage to become nearly irrelevant. In fact, responding to that, many states have raised their own minimum wages accordingly. Similarly, we've seen an incredible, a long, slow decline of labor union activity, of institutional representation of workers in the US. Labor unions have many problems. I don't think one should just sort of view them as an unalloyed good thing, but their absence is not an unalloyed good thing either. And if you were to remove the public sector from here, this number would be well below 10%. One consequence of this is that lower educated workers in the United States earn considerably less than in other high-income economies. So adjusting in purchasing power parity terms, you would find that low-wage U.S. workers, let's say they're earning $10.13 and $10.33 an hour in 2015. Well, if you want to find a lower-paid set of workers than that, you're going to have to go to the left towards Portugal or Greece or the Czech Republic. Now you can say, okay, well, don't compare me to Denmark and Norway and Germany. Those countries are just different. Sure, they're making twice as much, but maybe that's not meaningful. But let's just look at our neighbor to the north, Canada here, where people at McDonald's are making 30% more an hour than the United States. I do not think it's because they're 30% more productive per hour. That's a choice, about a public choice or a social choice about how much inequality we're going to tolerate, what we're going to require that employers provide and that the state provides to workers on a minimum basis. So rather than, I said I wanted to stop in 45 minutes, and so I'm going to just skip this section and move forward. The simple punchline of this section was to say that it's not obvious that all this inequality has done the US a lot of good. It has not made us grow faster or have better outcomes on average than the countries to which we compare ourselves, all of which have faced the same technological headwinds, the same globalization challenges. They've ended up roughly in the same place in terms of national income growth, but with much less inequality. And again, I think that's a choice. So let me talk about this question. Where will the work of the future come from? So I sort of said, look, we've not been running out of jobs. We've created lots of new work, and for many reasons. However, the distribution of those changes has not been altogether favorable. And in many ways, although the jobs per se are not the challenge, the quality of jobs really is a challenge, and particularly this kind of hollowing out. So you might legitimately ask, okay, but you've talked about the past, talk about the future. Well, of course, I know more about the past than I know about the future, so I tend to talk about the past. But one of the mandates of the Work of the Future Task Force was to survey these new technologies and ask, well, what else is on the horizon that's going to be incredibly consequential? And I think you can summarize our conclusions with a single sentence, which is that these momentous changes that we're looking at, the momentous technological changes, are unfolding gradually, meaning they are, so I want to emphasize two words there, momentous. That I don't want to suggest that they are not incredibly important. They are. But the other word is gradually. They are happening in calendar time, not overnight. So, we looked at examples including autonomous vehicles, industrial robotics, intelligent supply chains, additive manufacturing, and artificial intelligence. And all of these technologies are going to be highly consequential, and some of them already are. Autonomous vehicles have, as everyone is aware, were overhyped. They did not meet their promise. If you believe what was said 5 years ago, none of us would be driving a car anymore. We would all have, computerized chauffeurs. That has not come to pass, but it will. Over the next 20 years or so, a lot of our infrastructure will be rebuilt, and it will be rebuilt in a way that is compatible with vehicles that have a much higher level of autonomy. And that will be good. It will increase convenience and will dramatically increase safety and reduce vehicle deaths. However, it will displace a lot of people who do vehicle transportation for a living, but slowly. Industrial robotics, again, has been a huge success. And in certain narrow sectors, in heavy manufacturing, in automobiles, and steel, even in food, industrial robotics has raised productivity, increased quality, and reduced production worker employment. But this is a slow-moving process. You don't see many robots around you, and there's a reason for that. This is a really hard set of problems. It's really expensive. For many things that could, in theory, be done by robots, it's just not economical to have robots do them. It still makes sense for them to be done by people. Intelligent supply chains. This is actually a really big deal. It's not nearly as sexy, but part of the, if you think about one of our greatest industrial successes in the United States, Amazon, right? They are the world's greatest logistics company. They source things from all over the world. They get them into warehouses. They get them to your homes, and it's instantaneous, nearly instantaneous, cheap, and invisible. And this has changed the way labor is allocated, the way machines are used, trucking, assembly lines, warehousing. It's a remarkable change. At the moment, it's creating jobs, right? It's funny to realize that Amazon is one of the largest employers in the United States. And the reason is because they have so many people in their warehouses picking stuff. That will change. 20 years from now, Amazon will be a much smaller employer, even though they'll be a much bigger company, because much of that work will be done by robotics. Additive manufacturing, I don't know how many of you heard that term. Normally, the way we make things is what's called subtractive manufacturing. We start with a piece of material and we remove things of it until we get into the shape we want. Additive manufacturing is the opposite, where you basically add material through a printing process to build up objects. It's incredible, and eventually it will turn a lot of manufacturing into a mostly digital design activity where only the actual manufacturing will be the final step, where the designs and the ideas live electronically, and then you finally print them out when you're ready to use them. And that's a big deal. It will change the way we build things. Long way off. Right now, it's mostly used for prototyping and very, very fine parts, or even building replacement parts for airplanes and cars that are decades out of date. Rather than keeping the assembly line going, you just additively manufacturing the part as you need. Artificial intelligence. This is one where we have the least certainty. It's all around us at this point, primarily in consumer marketing and sales. We don't know what it'll do, but it doesn't seem to be advancing that fast. So again, let me just summarize. These are momentous technologies. They're extremely important, just like the computer revolution has been extremely important in changing the type of work we do and how we do it. But it's happening gradually, and there's time to take advantage of those benefits and manage your distributional consequences. So the challenge, again, is not the quantity of jobs, it is the quality of jobs. So let me bring this to a close by saying the hollowing out of the US labor market was not inevitable. Productivity growth decelerated, as I mentioned, but rising inequality played an even larger role in impeding income growth for the majority of workers. And there's quantitative work that supports that claim. Technological change was a headwind against middle-skill jobs, middle-class jobs over the last several decades. But many countries faced similar technological forces without generating the extremes of inequality that we've seen in the United States. Only in the United States, among other advanced economies, did polarization so severely erode the quality of jobs and so severely retard the growth of median wages. All countries that face these challenges, all of them have had some of these symptoms. The US really stands out, and not in a favorable way. This was in part ideological, not just technological. Ideology fostered the erosion of labor market institutions. There was a mantra that started 4 decades ago: the government is not the solution to the problem, it is the problem. And the view that the more the government got out of the way, the better the private sector would do in addressing all these issues. And you certainly can have too much government. You can certainly have too much regulation. You can certainly have overtaxation and inefficient bureaucracy. You can also have too little. And particularly too little in places where it matters. The federal minimum wage fell to near irrelevance. I would say that has been a negative. Private sector labor unions met rising employer hostility. We badly need to reform worker representation in the United States, not just restore it to the way it was, but what we've allowed it to do at present is just to ossify to the point where workers have very little ability to negotiate on their own behalf. And then we've had stasis in job standards, in social safety net protections, in civil rights legislation, in the modernization of labor market institutions for this changing structure of work and families. And so those were conscious choices. They mattered. They're driven by a view, a political view. I'm not saying altogether bad view, but we just need to recognize our own agency rather than think of these things as inevitable. They're not inevitable. And we can see from looking around us that many countries have made different choices and produced different outcomes. So looking forward, I would say institutional innovation needs to complement technological innovation. We need to invest and innovate in skills and training. And that's a kind of a bland thing to say. That's everybody says that. But let me just point out, if we compare what the US spends on what we call active labor market programs designed to help workers who have been displaced, who have lost jobs, right? We spend 0.3% of GDP. We're putting us, way ahead of Mexico. However, compare us to, for example, Denmark, that spends almost 3% of GDP on worker training and worker reactivation. Now you might say, oh my God, don't compare us to one of these like sclerotic, welfare states where nothing ever changes and nobody ever moves and everyone's stuck in place and the government regulates everything to death. You might be surprised to know, maybe many of you know this, Denmark has a more flexible labor market than does the United States. Many more people are hired and fired in Denmark than they are in the US. People have no expectation of long-term job security in Denmark. They have an expectation of long-term employment security, and that's because the state works with employers, totally allows and supports the ability of employers to grow and contract, to expand and contract as they need, and then provides lots of complementary investments to make sure that workers are retrained and able to re-enter the labor market when they are let go. We need to ensure that productivity gains translate into better quality jobs. And I've emphasized all along, I think this is a choice. This is not simply an inevitable market consequence. I pointed out previously how much these things had diverged over time. And I would say part of this is a decision about how work should be rewarded. This is a nice letter to the editor of the New York Times written by Daniel Wasik, who's a machinist in Fanwood, New Jersey, and who's since become a kind of recognized figure speaking on this topic. And he writes in his letter, we must find a more equitable balance between wages, productivity, and profits. A rise in productivity should trigger a rise in salary, and when profits soar, the working people instrumental in that success should share in its bounty. And I think that point of view is hard. It is hard to argue with. We have had massive productivity increase and we've had massive profits increases. And the main difference between the present and other eras or the last 4 decades of years is the distribution of those gains rather than the availability or existence of those gains. A lot of the what has changed has been to who those benefits accrue rather than whether they are generated. Finally, we need to expand and shape innovation itself. As I've tried to emphasize, where innovation occurs, that's where new work occurs. Where new work occurs is where a lot of opportunity comes from. Innovation is not an autonomous process. It's not a case of people sitting in laboratories shouting eureka when they come across a new invention. It is a directed process where we choose what problems to work on, what to prioritize, and who pays for it. Whether that's the space race, whether that's the invention of the internet, whether that's all types of health technologies in which the US spends an enormous amount of public money and has a leadership role. But over time, the federal share of public investment in R&D, research and development, has fallen from about 40% to about a quarter of all R&D. Now, the private sector has stepped in, that's expanded. However, arguably, these are complements, not substitutes. What the government pays for is often fundamental research. What the private sector often pays for is commercialization research. And so we would like both to happen. And of course, when the government is involved, it can help set the priorities and often historically has. Okay, so let me just conclude. I've gone a little bit longer than I promised I would, and I apologize for that. The work of the future is not inevitable. It is ours to invent. If we deploy new technologies into existing labor systems, we will get the same problematic results that we have seen over the last 4 decades. There's a palpable fear of the future out there. People are genuinely worried about what will automation and technology do to their jobs. I would say that's a consequence, a logical consequence of the divergence between innovation and labor market opportunity over the last 4 decades. If you want to see a case of technology advancing and people getting richer, but the typical person not benefiting, you don't have to look to the future. You can look to the last 4 decades and see that happening. So clearly, people have a reason to be skeptical that all these new technologies will benefit them. Simultaneously, we should reject these trade-offs, these false trade-offs, in my opinion, between economic growth and strong labor markets. These go together. We don't have to accept the idea that if we want to have growth, we have to have tons of inequality. We have not seen evidence to support that view. It's possible to buttress labor market institutions and innovate simultaneously in a way that not only creates shared prosperity, but creates political space for experimentation and for investment. The majority of today's jobs had yet to be invented a century ago. And so the job of the present is to build a future that we want ourselves and our children to inhabit. And we have lots of agency to build that future and lots of opportunity. And recognizing that agency will help us, make better choices. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the conversation, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Welcome back to the Summer Lecture Series 2021. Our moderator for this session is Bruce Sacerdote, Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College. His areas of expertise include labor markets, child and youth organizations, youth outcomes, and peer effects. He is a member of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Roland. I really appreciate it. Thank you to OSher for organizing this, and thank you so much to David for coming and speaking with us today. Roland emphasized this at the beginning of the session, but David really is one of the premier labor economists thinking about these topics, and it's a huge treat for all of us to hear from him. I mean, you're really hearing from one of the top thinkers and sort of people on the cutting edge of these problems. So thank you again, and there's such a huge set of topics that's addressed here, and we got a lot of great questions in the chat already. I'm going to try to. I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I'll try to pick some of the questions that relate to questions that I had. But don't be discouraged. I think we're going to get to a lot of. We've got about 30 or 35 questions so far, and I think we'll get to a lot of these. So let me start with something that I mean, this talk was really almost a brief history of everything because it took us through 100 years of what happened in labor markets and the economy. And so obviously David couldn't get to everything and all the interacting market forces that led us to where we are. One thing that he didn't talk about, and we've got a lot of questions on, are the role of workers to sort of choose their level of skill and what they go into. And I feel like maybe people have been very slow in getting the message as to what are the sorts of skills that will lead to success in the labor market, or the adjustment has been slower than you might have thought. And here's a question from Laura Bellback that gets at that. She writes, there's a current expectation for all young people to attend college after high school. Now there's a shortage of people in the trades. Can the education system adjust to support kids going into the trades or college? So David, why don't you take that, and then I might comment on that. I might comment on her question or your answer, depending on where we go.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Bruce, for being here as well. And it's an honor to speak with you. On the question, so yeah, of course, it is up to individuals as well to choose what skills they acquire, what educational investments they make. And of course, we have a very decentralized system that has many ports of entry for people to make choices. One of the virtues of the U.S. education training system is that it is flexible and that people can change careers at different points in their lives and make investments as they like. And in many other advanced countries, in some sense, the state pays for your education, your training, but you don't get to make repeated choices. And in fact, there's a lot of different kind of critical points where you were, you go into academic versus non-academic track, or what type of apprenticeship and so on. So our system has strengths. I don't think that there's been for a long time a kind of a college for all mantra in the US that everybody, and we have done a lot to get more people into colleges, although we're not very good at getting people to graduate college. But it's not clear that that's really the only place we should be investing. In fact, I think it's clear that it's not the only place we should be investing. And the challenge in the US is if your goal is to go from high school to a four-year college and enter one of the professions, you have a very straight and narrow path. It's really well understood, and there's a million different services from in your high school and beyond telling you exactly how you proceed, follow that path. If you want to enter the trades, if you want to enter the medical paraprofessions, if you want to be, work in skilled repair and technician, many of these there are good skilled jobs there. They don't necessarily run through a college degree. And it's much, much less clear how you go about pursuing them. We don't have the kind of guiding superstructure around vocational education in the United States that we do around professional education. And so in most other advanced economies, this is much more systematic, right? It isn't, there's not the same kind of wild west of, well, should I go to a for-profit or a nonprofit? Should I go to my community college? Should I try to get training through an apprenticeship with my labor union and so on? So we underinvest in vocational work, and as a result, I think people feel like have to go to college to find their way into some systematic form of opportunity. If we did the vocational training more effectively, fewer people would need to go to college, and we would fill those needs, as you were talking about. There are opportunities and will be opportunities in the trades, in construction, in plumbing, in electrical. There will be tons of work in healthcare, some of it highly skilled that doesn't necessarily require a college degree. So there's a lot to do, and it's not all professionals sitting at desks, talking on Zoom.
Yeah, thank you. No, I very much agree with that. I would actually, but with one caveat. It's well, let me just go back to, I think your sort of Canada-US and Canada-Europe comparison is a very apt one, because these are both very high income places facing similar global shocks. I would argue that a key difference between, say, Scandinavia or Switzerland and the US is not simply that they have a higher minimum wage, but they're particularly adamant about training their young people that they're selecting a profession, and that could be a skilled trade, and good at getting people through that. And so that gets to the point about there being guided pathways. That's actually the name of a lot of programs in the US in community colleges. Pathways is the way that we're trying to get young people to, so they have a more illuminated path. I also feel like we've been unsuccessful. It's not that those paths don't exist. We've been less successful in getting young people to listen to it, or less insistent that people find a path or get on a path. So let me go to a different question, from a related question from Terrence Darcy, and I don't know if you have something additional to add to this, David, to what you already just said. What changes would you make to the U.S. education system to make for a more productive, equal, and happy society? Cost emphasis in STEM, analytic language arts, or ongoing continuing education beyond K-12 and college? So I guess let me summarize that. Would you emphasize STEM more? Would you emphasize trades more? What would you change? What would you change in K-12 in particular?
Yeah, super important question. So I would say, by the way, that the vast inequalities, the greatest inequalities in the U.S. education system, I think, are in higher education, not in K through 12. And it's not that K through 12 has deteriorated in any sense over time, but the demands being made on it are increasing, both from the diversity and needs of students and also from the expectation of the labor market. I think it's and of course, education is highly, highly decentralized in the United States. So it's very difficult to sort of, move things with federal policy. The most important innovations we've seen in K through 12 education in the US and elsewhere in the last decades, one is, of course, the creation of pre-K and universal kindergartens and so on. And those have been shown to have really long-term benefits. And, for a long time, this was kind of an article of faith without a lot of evidence. But recent evidence from my colleague, Parag Pathak, and Christopher Walters, an economist at UC Berkeley, really shows that these early interventions in K through 12 affect people's lifelong earnings, and not just through, kind of measurable, IQ-based skills, but through social skills, through what we call soft skills. So that's one area where we can invest, is by providing high quality education earlier. So it's not about longer or more intensive, that's about starting sooner. A second is, improving the quality of some schools. And, what has been one thing that has been really effective for urban schools is the charter school movement and the kind of no excuses schools, which have introduced high expectations, a lot of competition, and a lot of focus on improving outcomes for kids who are starting, in many ways behind. And this has been an important innovation. So I'm a supporter of not all charter schools are good. In fact, many of them are quite poor, but then again, the poor ones tend to fail, which is good. That's what we want them to do. So these have been important innovations. Beyond that, I would like to see more people moving into kind of STEM fields earlier. It's not that I think that STEM is, everyone should be in STEM. I do not think that. But there are a sizable number of people who go into STEM fields without having to go to four-year college degrees if they're doing computer support, security, or networks, or repair, or anything like that. The IBM P-Tech programs have been a model of starting people in high school in these technical fields, often going 1 or 2 years beyond that, and then moving directly into a career. So I think that's a good idea. And then the other thing that I think is so consequential is creating pathways from high schools into non-college careers. I really feel like the orientation of most high schools is, okay, you went into college, but you succeeded. Oh, you didn't go to college? Okay, well, oh well, too bad that one didn't work out. See you. And that is that's where we could do a great deal better. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my first stab at it.
Yeah, no, that's extremely helpful. And let me just add 2 things to that. One is that one thing I want to add, and one thing where I would disagree. The thing I would add is that none of what David is suggesting sort of goes against market forces. It's not like we're saying, oh, the market doesn't want people to have, a STEM education, but we're going to force it on them. It's more that I feel that somehow, people make these choices when they're 12 and 18. And, in some cases they're making choices that'll affect their entire working lives, and maybe they're not making fully informed choices, and we want to help further steer people in a direction that's going to be productive and helpful for them, or at least provide them with a lot of information, a lot of opportunity to try to help them. It's not that we're sort of trying to stem market forces. It's that I can't necessarily live with the consequences of unfettered market forces without people having sort of more information and making longer term decisions. The place where I would disagree is when you said it's not that K through 12 has deteriorated. In some places it has, or at least it had. And I think that if you look at, I think one of the potential forces of deterioration is that, over the last 40 years, when women entered all kinds of professional careers, this reduced the number of highly skilled, highly educated folks to work in the K through 12 system. And so that while I don't think it's at all true that where I live in Hanover, New Hampshire, there's been a deterioration of the K through 12 education. I think there's the potential that that's happened in some other school districts, and some large school districts. And so I think it's something that we have worried a lot about, and I think we'll continue to worry about, preventing or improving the quality of K through 12 education. I think that charter schools are a great potential way to do that. Let's jump to a different question here. This is an interesting question from Paul Efkind, or maybe I'm half blind. It might be Etkind. So Paul asks, will small and medium-sized businesses have equal access to the software and hardware that will drive mechanization of medium skill tasks? And if not, what does that mean for the competitiveness of small businesses?
Yeah, that's a super important question. This is actually this is a really important issue that a lot of the kind of leading business technologies of the present seem to require huge amounts of data and often a lot of capital. And so it is the case that there has been a kind of a fanning out of the kind of technological gap between the largest and most productive firms and others. And this is true in the US, it's true in Europe. And we don't fully understand this, but yeah, the implication seems to be that larger firms, more sophisticated firms, are gaining market share in many sectors. They command a larger share of all sales, not necessarily of all employment, because they're often not very employee heavy anymore. And this has, in some ways, some consumer benefits, right? It create, when the most productive firms are, kind of leading the charge, that means all of us have, more convenience or lower prices and so on. But it also creates issues for competition policy. And certainly this is something the Biden administration is extremely attuned to, to the dismay of a lot of the tech sector in particular. And yeah, it's a concern. And the U.S. in many ways is kind of fallen short in competition policy. You know, we pay higher prices for airfares, for mobile telephony, for internet at home. We face less competition in these sectors than other wealthy countries, and I think we pay for it. So there are a lot of the federal government has often played a role in technology extension programs in agriculture and manufacturing, trying to help smaller farms, smaller businesses to adopt leading technologies. And this has, historically been extreme. The U.S. agricultural extension schools actually has, had an amazing historical track record of success of bringing high-tech farming to smaller farms. This is again something the Biden administration is trying to revive in manufacturing. It's hard to do, and it is the case when you talk about things, for example, like robotics. Robotics are not friendly to small firms. Robots that can be incredibly productive, they're expensive to buy, but they're much more expensive to program and integrate. And you often have to redesign your assembly line around. It's not a matter of you fire a worker, you hire a robot. It's that you change the way you do things, and then you need to make a large run of that product for that to pay off. If you're making short custom runs for lots of customers, in general, robotics is not going to be cost effective because the fixed costs of installing and of integrating are too high. That will change over time, right? So, for example, cloud-based software allows small companies to access, all of the computing resources and data storage resources that only used to be available to large companies. Maybe robotics will go that way, but at the moment, it is the case that the sort of technology landscape appears to be more hospitable to larger, more sophisticated, more capital-intensive firms.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that one of the most interesting changes in the investing world and in the real world is just this sort of, it's a bit extreme to call it a winner-take-all market, but just the globalization of markets, whether it's entertainment or whether it's goods or delivery of goods, is just leading itself, even like ride sharing, it's leading itself to these larger and larger firms. And that's in part driving the wealth of the 1%, because the folks who have the winning firm in that market just reap tremendous benefits. Let me just, and I'm going to change tax. I just want to add a reminder to all this, because David and I have both been talking about different government policies to moderate competitive problems and to moderate issues in the labor market and to moderate inequality in wages. That don't forget where David started with all this, which is that there's been tremendous income growth in this country, and it's tremendous change has accompanied tremendous productivity growth, which is accompanied, tremendous income growth and increases in consumption. And it's really how do we moderate that? How do we manage that? It's not that everything has gone to hell in a handbasket since 1940, and that I would suggest, we'd all be better off if we were living in 1940, but rather it's like there's been this huge and positive trend, but the wave hasn't hit everybody equally. I think that's what we're talking about. Now there's two demographic questions in the chat, which I think, so this is a bit of a shift of gears, David. From Alan Schnur, did women entering the workforce with many to service jobs from the 70s result in reduced wages when increasing the labor force, say doubling it, have a downward effect on wages? And then conversely, with higher earning women marrying higher earning men, would this double high and low household incomes and increase inequality just through a sort of a combination effect? So would you have expected, with this huge increase in the labor force, would you have expected that to put a lot of downward pressure on wages? That's our first question.
Yeah, people have looked at this, and I think the answer is not really, because when, in some sense, when women enter the labor force, that means that actually many more people are employed in domestic jobs, right? That a lot of things just get marketized. It's not that these other household activities are, it's not that they then just displace labor, right? Some of the actual work still gets done. Just some of it goes, you pay for childcare. Yeah, you pay for housekeeping. You pay, you buy new clothes instead of, sewing them at home. So I don't think that women entering labor force has had a downward effect. And in many ways, women entering labor force has been, one of the salvations of our economy, in that it's provided a huge supply of skills, and women are now considerably more educated than men. And this is true in all over the world. Women are much more likely to complete higher education. They do better through high school. That was always true. Now that what has changed is they also go on to higher education and attain more. And they have, filled the professional ranks much more rapidly than men in law, in medicine, not as much in science and engineering, and that's a loss. This is this is, it's hard for me to see well, I guess I could find some downsides, but by and large, this has been a very good thing. In terms of what you said about higher education marrying higher earning men, I mean, there's a lot of assorted mating. The biggest difference actually is the rate of marriage itself. That high educated individuals tend to get married and stay married and raise kids in a this traditional family, traditional unitary two adult family. And that has huge advantages for their kids. It's, the stability, the presence of two adults, and the financial security, is obviously fertile soil for raising kids who can, focus on learning and develop skills. For many women without college education, something more than approximately 40% of all U.S. children are born out of wedlock. Most of those children will be born into households where there will not, even if there's marriage, it will tend to be unstable. And so there's a huge family disadvantage gap in the US, much more than other places. There are many places where the institution of marriage is passé. That's fine. Laws don't even expect people to be married. You're partners, and that's a legal arrangement and so on. There's a real difference in the US. When people are not married, it doesn't just generally mean it's nominal. It's real in that the stability of those households, the likelihood of two adults, the same adults being present, in fact, having the same overlapping set of kids, is relatively low. And that's a real difference. And I think that's an enormous disadvantage for the structure for kids who are not from middle-class incomes, who are not from two-parent college parent families. And I don't think this has to do with women entering the labor force. It has to do with a lot of important societal changes. But I think it is problematic for childbearing.
Yeah, I think, and as I say, this talk is a brief history of everything, and that is a really important fact in the U.S. that has enormous implications for kids' outcomes, and that we haven't touched on yet. So I think that's absolutely right. And just a corollary to what David was saying is that rich people and high education people tend to make choices and investments that reinforce their success, and it reinforce their kids' success, and it further contributes to the inequality. Not that we should beat back that success, but that is inequality does tend to feed on itself. There's another demographic question here. How important are age demographics? This is from Terrence Darcy. How important are age demographics for the future of work? The age pyramid is narrowing and perhaps flipping as people live longer.
Yeah, so there are two consequences of that. I mean, there are many, but two really important ones. One, of course, it changes the dependency ratio, meaning the number of adults who are retired relative to the number of adults who are of prime working years, or working force years, which typically we think of as 18 to 64. And so that creates real pressures on taxation, and you're asking each individual worker to care for a larger number of people who are not currently working if you have a kind of a pay-go system like we have with Social Security. So that's one challenge that creates. And the other, of course, is it also makes the labor, it creates a scarcity of young workers. And the scarcity of young workers is not an altogether bad thing, because that actually tends to put upward pressure on wages and make it more possible for people to make a decent living, even in jobs where even in many of these service jobs. So for example, right now we're seeing many jobs in restaurants and hotels and sales clamoring for workers, and they're bitching and complaining about this, but they're also paying higher wages. And that's a good thing because wages are very low in those activities. Partly automation responds to this as well. The countries that have the highest robot density, meaning robots per 1,000 workers, are some of the oldest countries in the world. Countries that have the oldest age structure, including Japan, Korea, and Italy, and even China, which is aging very rapidly because of they really accelerated the process through the one-child policy, and now they have very large cohorts relative to young people, and in fact, the population is either static or contracting, and they also have very high robot density. So I do think it's there are many good things, right, about population not growing so rapidly. But the transition period between rapid growth and slowdown is actually quite challenging. And if you want to see that up and close, you can look at Italy or you can look at Japan. In Japan, they have entire villages that have mostly populated at this point by a few people and dolls. They actually do this thing where they populate villages with anime, or not anime, but anyway, as populations contract. So it's an economic challenge, it's a social challenge. It has environmental benefits. It may, it leads us to a more sustainable future in some ways, but it creates specific pressure points that we are seeing already.
David, let me go back to something you said in the middle of that answer, that there's this huge lack. I forgot now, I had it on the tip of my tongue, but let's call it 1 million fewer restaurant workers now than there were in 2019. And that's really putting lots of upward pressure on wages. Talk a little bit about A, why you think that is, but B, is this a even more powerful force, an even more powerful way to get wages up in those occupations than, say, a minimum wage or some other form of government regulation?
Yeah, so everybody, myself, among them, is really surprised by the tight labor market that we're experiencing right now. I mean, tight labor market meaning a lot of jobs seeking workers rather than workers seeking jobs. I think many of us anticipated that coming out of the COVID pandemic, there would be fewer restaurants, there would be hotels would be in trouble and so on, and so that there would be sort of depressed labor demand. But what's happening instead is those sectors are smaller, but the workforce of them is smaller still, and we don't know why. Right, there are a number of possibilities. So one is, of course, people are nervous about being physically in contact. So this is sort of an overhang of the disease threat. Another possibility is that actually people saved an enormous amount of money during the pandemic because the government did so much transferring of income. Poverty fell, and household savings increased by more than $1 trillion, which is just enormous. And so people are just not in that much of a hurry to go back to work. A third possibility is that people decided, hey, we were really not structuring our lives in a way that was making us happy. Maybe we need to downshift. Another possibility is part of it is that, part of this is the incentive effect of the pandemic unemployment insurance system that have made it easier for people to wait a while before they go back to work. And we're going to be learning. I think the evidence on that is quite mixed. I probably don't have share the opinion that it's had no effect. But we're going to learn more about that as these benefits are coming to a close and coming to a close early in these Republican led states. But in general, I'm not upset about this. I think that the economy is not there to maximize output; it's there to maximize people's individual welfare. And if they choose to work less and have lower income, and they're happier with that, that's good. And yes, I think the reduction in labor supply creates the type of upward pressure on wages and benefits that we desperately need. And I don't think it's either or with a minimum wage, but if you ask me if I could enact a single policy that improved labor market conditions for lots of workers rapidly, I would say, tight labor markets. Let's have really, really low unemployment and lots of labor demand. That's hard to normally achieve. We actually saw that coming into the pandemic, that we were actually in that position. Most of us did not expect to be back there so soon. But I'm cautiously optimistic that moves us in a good direction in terms of restoring some worker leverage over working conditions and wages and benefits. That doesn't mean I don't think this problem fully solves itself. I think there's more kind of labor standards that are needed about expectations of consistent hours, of the benefits that about paid vacation and family leave and medical leave. I think we leave too much of that just unattended to, but I'm overall optimistic about the state of the labor market, and I'm happy to see the scarcity of workers relative to jobs.
Good. And so following up on this, Daly Walker asks, how should the current labor shortage influence immigration policy?
Okay, so that's a super important question. I don't think it should influence immigration policy in the sense that I think immigration policy should be different, but I thought that before the current labor shortage. So, I think that the first, the terrible mistake the Trump administration made was to clamp down on the H-1B program and to make it harder for people to come here as students. And, one of the great, secrets of our success in the United States has been to attract the most motivated, the most capable, the most entrepreneurial people from all over the world, bring them into our university systems, let them loose on our entrepreneurial system, and have them produce some of the world's most successful companies. And you don't have to look very far to see how diverse the leadership is of a lot of the the most important, most innovative companies in the country and in the world. I mean, the U.S. actually still has the majority of the top 10 companies in the world. It's actually remarkable. So despite our many flaws, we remain highly innovative. So I think that's just incredibly, incredibly foolish. That we live in a world, this clamp down on highly skilled individuals. We live in a world in which, great talent is scarce and talented people have their choice of countries. And, in academia where Bruce and I work, right, many of our colleagues are from overseas. More than half of my colleagues in MIT in economics, 4 of whom are Nobel laureates, right, were not born in the United States. And so that is just, we're just, cutting our own legs out from under them with that. On immigration of less educated workers, I think there's more room for debate. The evidence is surprisingly not supportive of the idea that low educated immigrants have had a large adverse effect on US workers. In many ways, they lower prices and they seem to complement the skills of others. But we have to have a rational policy. We can't have an immigration policy that's based on people get here illegally, and then after a while, we sort of give them amnesty, and then we start again. You need to have a kind of a combination of humane policies, a reasonable path to citizenship, and then some mechanism of choosing the quantities of people who are allowed to come in. So that's it's a moral issue, it's a political issue, and it's an economic issue, and it's foolish. I feel fully comfortable making bold statements about what we ought to do with high skill immigration. On low skill immigration, I feel like that is a much more of a public choice issue where economic factors are important but should not be entirely determinative. Bruce, feel free to disagree with me.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, that's a very nice summary. I wanted to emphasize for the audience, one of the things David said was, he pointed out, well, one of the secrets of our success is the immigration of high skilled people, and that we've got a huge fraction of the largest and most innovative companies. So this is not simply a talk saying that, well, everything's better in Europe. I mean, we have tremendous areas of success, right? We have the deepest capital markets. We have the most innovative venture capital system in the world. We have probably the highest home ownership rate and the highest levels of housing consumption as well, and housing quality, and the deepest mortgage markets, and by far the lowest cost of financing a home for those who make it up to the barrier of being able to buy a home. So we have lots of things going for us. Let me jump to a different. I've got a lot of questions on climate change, which shouldn't shock you, David, if you think about what's on people's minds these days. So from from Bruce Menke, how significant will the shift be from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources with respect to the job market? Is it trivial, or is it going to be super important?
I think it'll be super important. There's a huge amount of infrastructure to be built, and a lot that needs to be re-engineered, and that's going to create generations of public works. So I think it's going to be really consequential. And I think the U.S. unfortunately has been so behind the curve in kind of taking this problem seriously, that we've given up leadership opportunities that we would have in green power, in windmills and solar, and electrification, and so on. And I think so that is unfortunate, but it's not too late to change it. We're still going to have to make these investments in ourselves. Of course, it will. Of course, it will create winners and losers, right? Just like the coal producing regions in Appalachia have suffered for decades with the loss of coal employment, places that are highly reliant on producing petroleum are going to see long-term decline. Now, it's going to be a slow process. So, it's also going to change the nature of auto manufacturing, right? Which is going to be much less labor intensive. And there'll be fewer people involved. Electric cars are much simpler. And in Germany, this is a huge national concern, right? There's so much specialized employment in making transmissions, in making fuel injection systems, in making suspensions and drivetrains, so much of which are so much simpler on electric cars. Electric cars are mostly software, upholstery, and some tires. So a couple of little DC motors. So I think it's a big deal, and I think we this is an area where investing in ourselves will pay off. And we just saying that things are too expensive is it's sort of in the long run you have to do them. But often we make these big pushes, these big public works pushes. They have the borrowing is cheap. The immediate effect on labor demand is positive, and the long run benefits of an improved infrastructure affect not just convenience, not just emissions, but also productivity and efficiency, and the attractiveness of citing companies and businesses and industries, because you have good infrastructure to support it.
So, David, how optimistic are you that we will innovate ourselves out of a really carbon intensive economy? And do you think that this will take forever, or will this be a quickly accelerating trend, the way sort of electric cars are the presence of the electric cars rapidly accelerating? Do you think we're going to innovate ourselves away from a super carbon intensive economy, and can we do it in our lifetime so quickly?
I mean, there's a question of could we and will we, right? So could we? For sure. It would be expensive, yes, but on the other hand, not acting on it is also extremely expensive. Will we? I don't know. A lot of it depends so much on political factors that are extremely hard to predict, and it also depends on global coordination, which is extremely hard to achieve. So, I'm encouraged. The example of electric cars is an encouraging one, right? Because forever people said, "Well, never catch on. There'll be a niche," and then all of a sudden, all these manufacturers are announcing that the electric car, they'll stop making internal combustion passenger vehicles, within 15 years. And that's incredible. So I hope we reach a similar tipping point with these lower carbon technologies, but it's going to be very difficult to get there. You're not going to get there with airplanes anytime soon. And it's going to require enormous change in our energy production infrastructure and our energy transmission infrastructure. And that cannot, even if we decide today that was our highest priority, we'd be working on it for the next 25 years to achieve what we set out to do at present.
And I just want to point out the importance both of private companies and of personalities. I don't want to hold up Elon Musk as sort of a paragon of what all Americans should behave, but you can't deny that one cannot deny that he has an enormous influence on the pace of innovation in that industry. And this is not something that I would have ever predicted, or that and it's happened very, very rapidly. And
notice, by the way, born in South Africa, came to the US to do his work here.
Right. Now let's see. So I'm going to switch to a topic. This is another question from Bruce Menke, and it's one that you know a fair bit about, David. It's actually a 5-part question, so I'll let you choose. You get to choose your part. It's very short, but it has a lot in it. Can you discuss disparities among different sexes, different racial and ethnic groups? It's the last part I think you'll like. Different age groups, urban versus rural, and small town population groups. So pick any of those and talk about how the disparities have evolved and where you think this may be headed.
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I guess there are many, many, many things one could say about this. I think the one that's sort of most troubling has been the stalled economic progress of race groups in the US, or at least of African Americans, since really over the last 4 decades. And it's not fully understood why that's been the case. But the progress, the closing of the economic income, or the race gaps in incomes, happened very fast in certain periods of time. It happened very fast, particularly in the 1960s. And it was associated with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which actually caused the way state governments to be much more responsive to African Americans, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, even with the Fair Labor Standards Acts of 1963, which essentially brought the minimum wage into many sectors in which they were dominated, or at least had huge overrepresentation of African American workers, including in restaurants and other service activities that previously had not been covered by the minimum wage. Now we know that it actually had a big effect on racial inequality. So, based on those events, people thought, oh, great, problem solved, just connect the dots, the trajectories are converging, we won't be talking about this, 5 decades later. Well, unfortunately, that's not true. And a lot of that progress appears to have stalled in terms of income levels, in terms of rates of employment, and all other observable factors of, well-being, including, life expectancy, for example. Why has that occurred? We don't really know. I don't think it's that racism has become more intensive. I don't think that we are a more racist country than we were 4 decades ago. I'm certain that's not the case. If you look at the rates of intermarriage, or people's approval of intermarriage, or the fact that we've had an African-American president and so on, it's just, of course, there's racism. It's important. It's, it matters every single day. It's not getting worse as far as I can tell. It's gotten a lot better. Part of what has been a headwind, many people think, to this convergence is the changing structure of the labor market that has become so much more focused on the technical and interpersonal skills that go along with college degrees. And those have been, even the periods of greatest African-American economic success were much more in blue collar work and in manufacturing and in union work, not in offices. Not in the professions. I'm not saying that's as it should be. I'm saying that is as it is. And so as the great rewards have moved into professional and technical and managerial work, have moved into people in high-level STEM positions, people who are, have these leadership roles, it has it has meant that, minorities are much more swimming upstream than they used to be. So I think there is an area of stalled progress, a great deal of frustration. And of course, this is seen much more among African-American men than among African-American women, and more among Hispanic men than Hispanic women as well. So that is a big disparity, and a concerning disparity, and one that, I think requires further push. Right, just like these great pushes we made during the era of civil rights, we need to keep pushing. Although, if you ask me what specifically to do, I would have less of a good answer to that question. On the other, I won't take on all these other disparities, but I can't resist the urban one. So, we have this image in our mind of, urban areas as these kind of escalators of opportunity, as you just, whoever you are, go to the big city and, just ride the wave upward. Unfortunately, the evidence is that has changed a lot, that US cities over the last, really since around 1990, they've become much more highly educated. They pulled ahead of the rest of the country in terms of concentrations of highly educated adults. They've actually become somewhat younger relative to the rest of the population, as people have moved into urban areas and refreshed changed this demographic structure there. But they've really become, lands of opportunity for people who are highly skilled and highly educated, and the kind of trajectory of jobs and earnings in urban areas has really bifurcated in just the way I was showing you with this polarization earlier. That among people who do work in finance and engineering, in design, in advertising, marketing, and medicine, big cities have the highest pay levels, even adjusted for cost of living, for people with these specialized skills. But for people without them, jobs become much more generic, and there's less, coexistence in offices and in factories between highly educated and less educated workers, and much more of the urban labor market is just a service economy for the comfort and convenience and health of the affluent, performed by people without college degrees, whether that's, in restaurants, in hotels, in condominiums, in transportation, in entertainment and recreation, healthcare. And so urban areas don't offer the same level of upward mobility, we think. They don't offer the same, hot urban wage levels relative to non-urban wage levels that they used to. And so it's actually, it's a challenge, because it means the sort of standard route, that the standard advice that you might give someone about, go to the big city and, find your way, is less applicable than it used to be. So I hope that's enough disparities to address some of the question.
Yes. Yeah, no, in a way, I mean, this is a lot of what labor economists do, is think about these disparities and the sources of them, and then the opportunities that there might be to reduce them. So Michael Mayer asks, and this might have been a good one to say for the last question, but I'm going to go with it now. Given all this, what would moderate the sense of despair, angst among the less well compensated? And it comes with a suggestion, which you can address or not address. Would it help to alter the payroll tax machinery to boost lower earnings into clearer air?
Sorry, the last.
Okay, never mind. I knew you wouldn't get that analogy. I think by clearer air, he's thinking like a pilot and thinking higher and cleaner. But so let's take these questions in turn then. What would moderate the sense of despair and angst among the less well compensated? And then we can talk about payroll taxes after.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and this is, and certainly it's a question the Biden administration is asking itself all the time, right? How do we, restore the sense that, this is not just an economy set up for the elite? And I do actually think, raising minimum wage has some of this effect. I do think the efforts to, improve these child tax credits, your income tax credit, so on, we're going to help. But obviously, it's not sufficient to just receive transfers. People need to feel like they're being remunerated for their hard work. And so in some sense, that some of that requires reinvestment. So some of these infrastructure investments that we're talking about are going to have those benefits, trying to bring prosperity out of the kind of wealthy coastal cities and into other places. So I think public investment is going to help with this. I wonder, and I hope, that the pandemic will actually lead to some deconcentration of, everybody feeling they have to be in Boston, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, or, Research Triangle to get ahead. But I don't fully know the answer, but I think it's a sort of existential political question certainly for the Democratic Party. Would the payroll tax, the payroll tax is regressive, but it's not the biggest part of it. And I actually think we do need to make taxes more progressive, but that in some sense means, I think, treating capital gains differently, removing the step up capital gains depreciation, or for in the inheritance tax structure and so on. But the other thing I think that helps a lot, of course, is having tight labor markets, as Bruce and I were discussing earlier. And hopefully the Biden administration is taking a big risk on the idea that the inflation that we're seeing is temporary and the tight labor markets should continue. I think that's a calculated risk. No one knows for sure. I think that, if I were a gambler, that's where I put my money, but it's a gamble.
Excellent. And there are many opportunities to make that in financial market statement. So on that optimistic note, I think we're going to David and I will wrap up our discussion. This has been tremendously illuminating. And so we covered an insane amount of ground in 2 hours, and I really appreciate your being here with us. Roland, I'm going to kick it back to you for final words.
Thank you to our speaker, David Autor, and to our moderator, Bruce Sacerdote. It's a shame that we didn't have even another hour to answer and listen to great questions that have come in, some 40 today. And we could certainly have gone on for another good hour to listen and learn. We hope you have enjoyed today's session. And next week, we will hear from William Frey, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, who will speak about the changing face of America. We hope to see you then.